Now, I've alluded to this in the prior chapter. In 1619 was the year that the first African slaves were brought to what is present day North America. Um, but it wasn't really until the mid 1600s that large scale uh, amounts of slaves were brought to the Americas. Because by that time, now you had more settled populations, you had your official colonies, you had your charters, you had English settlers, you had other sources coming in, which we're going to talk about the Scotch Irish in a little bit. Um, the demand for labor was really big. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, the preference for slaves over indentured servants was also really big. And in the mid 1600s, the slave trade had gotten pretty substantial. And the majority of slaves would come from this part of Africa right there. Okay, West Africa, around modern day Nigeria, around here, they would come from right around there. Around there in Africa, you had immense tribalism among many of the different African tribes who were often at war with one another. They were rivals with one another. And it was very common for African tribesmen to capture their rivals. And then, of course, you had the onslaught of Europeans who would make their way down to the Gold Coast of Africa, and they would basically have a human sell off. You have a destructive um, circumstance of war, and as a spoil of war, you get to permanently punish your rival by selling him into slavery. And then you have people who want to use that slavery for human bondage and use them to be put to labor because you have a need, you have a thirst for tobacco and sugar products. You have ready made land now. Okay, so you have now a track. The overwhelming majority of African slaves who were sold into slavery at African ports left from here, and they would make a passage all the way to the Caribbean, where eventually the overwhelming majority of them would be sold into slavery for markets on the east coast of North America and mostly into South America, namely Brazil. So you have a situation where these humans purchased into slavery would have to be brought and distributed in the Americas. Well, Africa is not right next door. There's a pretty substantial ocean right there. We know it as the Atlantic. And these African slaves would now have to be brought in various different ships so as to transport them for auction in the Americas. Okay? They would be stuffed into ships. Oftentimes, there may be 600 of them stuffed into basically human cubby holes, maybe 600 or so on a ship, with dank ventilation, hardly food, awful humid conditions, just conditions that are ripe for illness. And as such, a huge percentage of the Africans brought into slavery died in passage to the Americas, to which they would be thrown overboard. Okay, that was a very real thing. Okay, the passage from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas, from here to here, is known as the Middle Passage. That is the transport of Africans sold into slavery moving from Africa to the Caribbean. Okay, as far as Africans being brought directly to English North America, that was generally very small. The overwhelming majority of African slaves were brought to Caribbean islands and then sold and distributed from there. About 5% or so of African slaves would be brought directly to English North America. Okay? But that was fewer and further between. The overwhelming majority of them were originally distributed from the Caribbeans, of which the majority of them would make their way to South America. Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, French Guiana, Brazil. As I mentioned earlier, as awful as slavery was in our country, it's even bigger somewhere else. That's just to show you, not to minimize anything that's gone on here in our country, that's just to show you just how big the circumstance of slavery was for African slaves. Okay, so there are many different slave accounts, especially those who may have escaped and were otherwise able to write about their experiences in Middle Passage and what the auction was like. They would be brought to various different auction houses where they could be bid upon by those needing labor. Okay, and sometimes folks would look for various different physical attributes or whatnot, but otherwise, though, human beings were sold into slavery like they were pieces of property at an auction. The thought of that is reprehensible. Back then, it was seen as less reprehensible. And historians oftentimes argue back and forth about exactly how things were viewed back then, reasons and rationale why people would dehumanize other beings, other humans, and the rationale behind it. There is oftentimes a lack of consensus about certain things because people see things different ways. Okay? Some people think that slave traders rationed slavery as a need because they saw black people as inferior, and the way to help them is to actually manage them and put them to work and tend to them for ourselves and not for themselves, for their own good. Okay? Then there are others who are hell-bent on making a buck. Then there are others who rationed that the need for labor was ultimately beneficial for all, and maybe we could indenture some of these slaves. Okay, maybe eventually they could buy their freedom or have a period of contract to where they could eventually get out. The reality for almost all slaves, though, was that they would never leave slavery. Not in that era. So you have a brutal system of human trafficking, okay, that back then was deemed as being perfectly okay and rationed for various different reasons. We obviously know there's no good rationale for human slavery. The only thing that you could see that maybe is a point of discussion is that at almost every point of human history there's been some form of slavery. Humans have enslaved others long in world history. That does not make anything right. It's just the unfortunate circumstances that humans don't play nice with each other. And we have enslaved with each other and divided each other since the dawn of humanity. You look at slavery, the Jews were enslaved, Africans were enslaved. You have all kinds of slave history and historical accounts from various different civilizations all over the world and in all corners. Today, you have human trafficking, largely for the sex trade. Okay? It's estimated that in 2020 there are around 100,000 people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area alone that are victims of the sex trade and are being trafficked. That is awful in every way. Okay? So again, please understand, none of what I'm saying is to diminish the awful nature of African slavery. It's just to point out just how big the situation was and how we as people, as a global society, need to do a better job to understand how and why this happens and how we as human beings could avoid it, call it out. It's ugly, very ugly to think that something like this happened in our nation's history. The English brought it to our colonial establishment. Okay? But it was here to stay. Now, one company, the Royal African Company, had been the mainstay, the main monopoly for African slaves and auction. That was until the late 1600s, and then early 1700s, that monopoly was broken. And what happens when you have a multitude of companies selling the same product? Well, if you're selling the same product and you have choices, you're going to drive the price down, right? If one company controlled everything for one product that was popular for everybody, they could have a monopoly. They could charge whatever they want. Well, if you have competition, you're going to have to reduce your prices so as to survive. What happens when you reduce prices? I remember my parents buying a very large screen TV back in the 1980s, and back then it cost $2,000-$3,000. Nowadays you can get the equivalent size TV, and instead of it being a large piece of furniture, now it's about that thick. It's bigger, has surround sound. It's got DLP or HD TV, anything along those lines. It's beautiful. You can see it very clearly. And that's good sound, hooked up to a sound bar or anything else along those lines. You can go to Best Buy and get something like that for just a few $100. That's it. And it's a far superior product to what you previously had. Well, competition drives innovation, but then also competition drives down the price. And in the slave trade days, driving down the price meant that now slaves are more affordable. And if you have an expansive land and labor need, then you're going to be able to afford to have more slaves. So, the unfortunate circumstance of there being less competition on the market in the slave trade meant that slaves would be more affordable, and the increase in demand was now prevalent. So, by the mid-1750s, you saw a significant jump in the number of slaves. And at one point, in some English American colonies, by the mid-1700s, there were more African slaves or those that were enslaved than there were white populations. Okay? So, that's how tough it got for a lot of them. And as such, as you had southern economies in the Carolinas and in Georgia and in Virginia that had generally warmer climates, you had more of a tendency to have more of an agrarian-based economy, largely centered around tobacco and sugar at the time. So because you had a need for agrarian labor, you had larger concentrations of African slaves being brought to southern colonies. More so than in the north. In northern colonies, you did have slavery. They were largely put to labor. There were some agricultural fields, but it wasn't as large scale as it was in the south because their climate was not year-round. And you have a lot of urban environments to where slaves may have brought there, maybe put to manual physical labor in a shop or something else of the sort. Okay, so the type of slavery in the north was typically going to be different than the agrarian labor that you'd see in southern colonies. So hold that thought. Otherwise, though, other sources of people coming to English North America would come from outside of England itself. So going on back in Europe at that time, of course, you had the Reformation and you had the rise of Protestantism. And in England itself, you also had the Church of England, you had Puritans who had left, you had Quakers who were trying to resist persecution. You have a number of folks in France and in Germany who are not Catholic, and they are seeking to resist persecution if they worship differently. Okay? In Germany at that time was predominantly Catholic. You had a number of Germans who were not Catholic and they wanted religious freedom, and they didn't find a lot of that elsewhere in Europe. There's a new colony on the eastern coast of North America where colonies oftentimes are set up to, I don't know, allow for more than just one religion. Okay, now we're on to something. You have some Germans that came. You have the Huguenots from parts of France that would come. You also had a Scotch-Irish population that would also come. So in various parts of Northern Ireland, you had some folks who were Presbyterian, and Ireland itself being a predominantly Catholic island, they wanted to seek freedom to practice their Presbyterian faith. They found respite in various different parts of North America. Same thing with some folks from Scotland. So some of the Scotch-Irish people, they would move out sometimes out into the frontier of English North America. But otherwise, they were able to practice their faiths without persecution. You also had some mainstream Irish folks who would come from Ireland. Now, larger Irish immigration would come later. Hold that thought. But you did have some folks in Ireland at the time who came to English North America, and they abandoned their Catholic faith, and they would accept various different Protestant faiths and possibly even remove all Irish ethnic identities. It's easy to do when you look like other Europeans. You kind of blend in. Maybe you have red hair, or I don't know, you look like a leprechaun, I don't know. But otherwise, though, it's easier to do that than when you have a different skin color or whatnot. But otherwise, though, sources of European immigration were changing, and of course the dynamics of the slave trade changed the population in English North America too.